Yesterday, Noam Chomsky walked into a congressional office building, not to demonstrate or get arrested. For the first time in decades, he was officially invited to speak on Capitol Hill. The occasion was a forum sponsored by the 52-member Progressive Caucus of the U.S. Congress. There, in a packed congressional hearing room, the caucus unveiled their legislative program for the coming year. Dubbed the Progressive Promise, the 11-point program calls for big cuts in corporate welfare and military spending. It also outlines plans for a single-payer health care system, a job creation strategy, and it sets restrictions on influence peddling and special interest lobbying in Congress. Today we'll bring you some of the speakers from the Progressive Caucus, including Barbara Ehrenreich and Robert Borsaj. We also managed to interview MIT professor Noam Chomsky as he rushed out of the caucus forum yesterday and into the slush of a Washington winter to catch a plane back to Boston. I hailed a cab for him and jumped in. What better way to talk with someone who the New York Times calls arguably the greatest intellectual alive today? Just remember, Noam Chomsky says, don't trust the New York Times. So we're sitting here in the cab to the airport, coming from the Cannon building where you've just testified. Is this the first time you've been in Congress?
Well, I did actually testify once at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Senator Fulbright was running. It was toward the end of his career. He was already very turned off by Washington and everything that was going on there, and he had basically turned the Senate Foreign Relations Committee into a kind of a seminar on the Indochina War and foreign policy. And I was there actually with Arthur Schlesinger. We testified together. It was quite amusing. The only other time I ever remember being there was in April 1965. It was a couple months after the bombing of North Vietnam had started. Howard Zinn and I think we rounded up a couple of other faculty members, and we commissioned ourselves a committee of concerned New England professors or something respectable like that, and went to petition our representatives, So we went through the Massachusetts delegation, which was quite funny. It was 2 or 3 days after Johnson had given a speech giving one of these fake peace proposals, which we wanted to go through. First person we went to see was Tip O'Neill, who has now a reputation of being a fiery opponent of the war. He wouldn't let us into his office. He told the secretary he wasn't going to talk to anybody who was critical of the war, period. So we never even got past the secretary in that case. We saw Saltonstall, who was the senior senator, and he was very polite. He listened to us, and we gave our pitch very politely, and he said he didn't see what we were talking about. The president had spoken. What more is there to discuss? So let's go on to the next topic. We saw Kennedy, who was the junior senator, who was extremely affable. In fact, took us out to lunch in the Senate cafeteria or something. But he basically said, he listened, we talked, and he said he didn't really know a lot about the foreign affairs. That wasn't his bailiwick. It was sort of what his brothers did, but he listened politely, and we then went the rounds. About the only response that we got, and that was in fact some context that proved very useful, was with a couple of Republican congressmen, Brad Morse and Silvio Conti, from, I think they must have been in the western part of the state. And in fact, we kept close contact with them. So I had Brad Morse, I guess, was our representative, and we had him over to the house to talk to neighbors. When I got into when things happened down in the civil rights movement in the South, called his office, and they were helpful. And all through the war, these couple of Republican congressmen were quite helpful. Then, of course, remember this was early. By 1968, everything changed, because business had come out against the war, and even the New York Times came out against the war, so everybody was suddenly a long-time opponent of the war. But when you go back to then, it was not true. But I don't recall, in fact, for years, my association with Washington was the smell of tear gas. And as soon as I landed in Washington Airport, I could already feel it, because I was only here for demonstrations. So it was tear gas. I'll tell you about the Washington cell block. You want to hear about that? Not very nice. It's one of the worst jails to be in.
When were you in the Washington cell block?
Oh, quite a few times, but just for civil not for long, like a couple days or something. But and of course, if you're like a guest, they treat you nicely. But when you walk through down there, it is horrifying. I don't know what it's like now, but there are these cavernous black rooms, with figures in them. As far as you can tell, almost all black, maybe all black, and just as if it was just inhuman, and the conditions were. It wasn't a torture. The part we saw, at least, wasn't a torture chamber, but it certainly wouldn't pass any human rights conditions. But this is just passing through. But aside from, I saw a lot of the Washington cell block and the streets and tear gas and mace, but nothing about the congressional offices.
So what did it feel to actually be officially invited into the Cannon Building today?
Well, it's like, it's the kind of thing I do in every other country in the world, so not too surprising. I just came back from South America, where I was, among other things, made an honorary citizen of Buenos Aires. How do you like that, in the mayor's office? When I was in Australia, I taught the National Parliament building. It's like anywhere else. But this was good, because I think this is the first meeting well, you correct me, but as far as I know, this is the first meeting of a kind of progressive caucus in, I don't know how long. At least I can't even remember one. And it was a lively crowd. What I heard of it, they were saying good things. There are people like Bernie Sanders, who I know, John Conyers, who I know, and others who've been doing very good things for years. It's nice to see them with some troops around them.
So what do you think should be the agenda of the Progressive Caucus? How do you think a minority in the Congress can have an effect?
Well, first of all, they are a minority in numbers, but in terms of their public support, I think they're probably a majority. That is, if you judge by, public opinion studies are misleading, but I think they're misleading in the direction of underestimating their support, because when people are asked questions on polls, they're heavily influenced, but to some extent influenced at least by the propaganda they hear. So you have to compensate for that. But even if you just take the numbers, the general public is basically social democratic. Like by about 20-1, people think that corporations ought to sacrifice profits for the benefit of workers and communities. That's a long way from where workers were 100 years ago, when they said that workers ought to own the mills, But now they're saying, we want you to be benevolent autocrats, not, we don't think you have a right to rule. But so that's what I mean by social democratic, not what working people used to say. Overwhelming majorities of the population believe that, like in this, it depends how you ask the question, but like 70 to 80%, that the government, that we have a responsibility through the government to provide basic health care, daycare, support for people who are needy, right through the Reagan years. And as far as I know, still, people were even in favor of higher taxes for things like education, environmental protection, welfare, and so on. Here's where you have to be a little cautious. Like, if you ask people questions about welfare, they'll say they're against it. But if you ask people, do you think that we should support, women with children who need help, they'll say, yeah, we're in favor of it. The reason, here's where you see the effectiveness of the propaganda system, which has created an image of welfare as, rich woman, by implication black, driving a Cadillac and reading, so you'll pay for it. Well, okay, if that's welfare, why should I pay for it? But if it's helping poor people who are in trouble, yeah, sure, we're in favor of it. Take a look at the budget. Everyone, standard line is the public wants the budget balanced. Extremely misleading. The way the polls are set up, there's two categories of questions. One is, do you want the budget balanced? Everybody says yes. Like, I'd say yes too. That's like saying, would you like your household debts eliminated? like your mortgage. Sure, terrific. On the other hand, as soon as you ask a realistic question, would you like the budget balanced if it means cutting back on health care or cutting back on education or anything you can think of, then there's overwhelming opposition. Just like if you ask people, you want your household debts canceled if it means your kids don't go to school and you lose your car and so on. Well, no. And I think you find, so to get back to your question, it seems to me that the potential support for a group like this is very, very large. Over 80% of the population regards the economic system as inherently unfair. Well, okay, it is. These are the ones who are talking about it. The agenda for them ought to be, and I don't know how you do this exactly, is to interact with sectors of the public who are willing to become organized or who they can help become organized and create the basis for the support that will make them not a minority but enable them to speak for what probably is the large-scale majority sentiment in the country. And that's a big task. I mean, they have to fight the commercial media, they have to fight the concentration of wealth. I mean, everything's going to try to stop them, but that's always been true.
They have to fight President Clinton.
Yeah, sure. President Clinton, if they can build up popular support, he'll float along with it. At the moment, I mean, he's looking where the money is and where the power is, and will continue to do so. But if it happens to shift in another direction, he'll be there. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is the communication system, which is, of course, overwhelmingly a propaganda system. The enormous concentration of power, the propaganda that tells you there's nothing you can do. It's the mysterious and infinite wisdom of the market. Just go home and shut up. The entertainment industry, we're just trying to glue you to, its conception of a good society is the social unit consists of a person in the tube, no interconnection among people, you and that thing over there. Well, the more you have to fight against that, starting with children. It's a continuing battle. It always takes new forms. I mean, in the last couple hundred years, it's been going on in one or another form without a stop.
What about right now? The Senate is confirming Madeleine Albright as the Secretary of State. And then if we run this at another point, we now have Madeleine Albright as the Secretary of State. What do you think of her?
She has some nice lines. My favorite was told the Security Council, when the Security Council was refusing to go along with some, one of the, one part of the Iraq boycott, I guess. She said, the United States will act, she said, we will act multilaterally when we can and unilaterally when we must in order to defend our interests. That's about right, So, okay, if you guys want to go along with us, that's fine. But otherwise, we're the biggest thug on the block and we'll do what we like.
Little change of venue here, but the question of her multilateral approach and using UN military forces and the U.S. military forces to intervene abroad.
I think that will continue as before. I mean, the U.S., first of all, has a unique military doctrine. Its soldiers are not allowed to be placed under risk. So the U.S. is automatically disqualified from any kind of peacekeeping operations. Anything that involves civilians, the U.S. can't be involved in. That's what happened in Somalia. I mean, if those had been Canadian forces or Irish forces, so nothing would have gone wrong. But when U.S. forces were placed under a threat, they reacted with overwhelming force, and it led to a total disaster. The UN forces in South Lebanon face much worse than that. But that's what you do when you're in peacekeeping forces. So the U.S. is quite willing to put forces in after the fighting is over, when it can pick up the pieces. And if there's multilateral forces under U.S. command, that's like in what happened in Croatia, Bosnia. As long as there was dirty work to do, Europeans do it. When there was a force introduced, it was under U.S. command, but no U.S. troops. Then after the two sides were more or less equal. When it became possible to implement what in effect is a partition of Bosnia, which is what they were after all along, and to do it without too much threat, the U.S. was perfectly willing to do it, and try to get Greater Croatia and Greater Serbia under its control, much to the discomfiture of the Europeans. And that's the kind of intervention that will take place. I mean, Haiti's a very simple example. U.S. did not support the embargo. It supported the military coup. The U.S. continued to trade. Trade went up under Clinton. Right through both the Bush and the Clinton administration, they permitted Texaco illegally to ship oil. This is perfectly well known to the press. It was all revealed publicly in the lead story on AP the day before the troops went in. Nobody could miss it. If you let oil go in, there's no embargo. They moved in when it was time, they felt, to restore the pre-election status quo, which then they moved the troops in.
And we'll be back with Professor Noam Chomsky in just a minute. You're listening to Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. I'm Amy Goodman. And just after we spoke, Noam Chomsky and I, we were now at the airport in Washington, D.C. I learned that thousands of Israeli police patrolled near Jerusalem mosques, searching Arab-owned cars and closing streets after 2 bombs in Tel Aviv wounded 13 Israelis. Israeli security forces traditionally go on alert for possible attacks during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, which began today, as devout Muslims flock to mosques and fast from sunrise to sundown. Also, the former head of Israel's Shin Bet Secret Service admitted in an interview published today ordering the killing of 2 captured Arab hijackers in 1984. Avraham Shalom, who resigned after a failed cover-up, said, "I gave an order to give them a few more blows and get it over with." But at the airport, once we got out of the cab, I did ask Professor Chomsky about his thoughts on what's going on in Hebron right now and the so-called peace process.
Well, this is a long story, but basically the whole Oslo agreement is a tremendous power play. The important part is that for 25 years, the United States has stood alone, literally alone, with Israel against the world, opposing some kind of 2-state settlement or some such arrangement, and the U.S. won. The Oslo agreements eliminate the Palestinians. In fact, what's being implemented, what's called the peace process, is more or less what South Africa instituted in the 50s and 60s, some kind of Bantustan policy. Actually, it's less. Norman Finkelstein's pointed out quite accurately, it's not as forthcoming as South Africa. South Africa committed itself to supporting the Bantustans. Israel has not, it's just prevented them from developing harshly and has given no commitment to them. Well, that's called the peace process. Well, it's pretty hard to implement that sort of thing. Hebron is one of the difficulties, but it's the whole system is so outrageous that to implement it is going to require force. And there's no serious difference between Labor and Likud on this. These are mostly rhetoric.
You pointed out that under Netanyahu, when we just talked after he was elected, that you thought that things might get better for the Palestinians.
They did. There are more Palestinians working. Part of the worst suffering of the Palestinians was these collective punishment imposed by the Labor government, which just makes them starve, the closures. Well, that was somewhat eased under Netanyahu. On the other hand, he's a little more, if you look at settlement policy, well, you have to wait a while and see because we don't really have the data, but it's not strikingly different. I mean, there's a lot of different rhetoric, but there's not much difference in the facts. In fact, over the years, Labor and Likud have mostly been a difference of style. The Likud, and it has to do with their base. I mean, the labor base is mostly westernized, kind of elite. People like Abba Eban. I mean, they understand the norms of Western hypocrisy. So if you want to put up a settlement, don't do it the day that the Secretary of State is there with a big banner saying, screw you or something. That's not the way you do it. You wait until he goes home, and then 2 weeks later, you send a few trucks out, and you don't make a new settlement. You thicken an old settlement, and then a little while later it turns into a new settlement. That's the way you do it. That's what the West likes. The West does not like this in-your-face style that goes along with these crude types. And I think that's probably the main difference, not much else.
Last question, it's on President Clinton's cozy relationship with Suharto.
Yeah.
The
like
dictator of
everyone else is,
Indonesia.
yes. I mean, the United States, it's not President Clinton, it is every U.S. Remember when Suharto came in with a huge massacre of maybe 500,000 or 1 million people, that was enthusiastically applauded in the West. I mean, there was, you read the New York Times, I mean, Time Magazine, you know, everybody was just completely enthusiastic. It was a marvelous thing. You know, a hope, a gleam of light in Asia, you know, they just applauded it enormously. Ever since then, Suharto's been the darling of the West. I mean, he wiped out the only mass-based popular movement. He slaughtered them. He ran a terror state. He opened the country up to robbery by Western investors. What's to complain about? Carter loved him. Everybody loved him. So yeah, Clinton's got, you know, did some crooked business with taking some money from his friends, but that's the least of it.
Do you predict East Timor will be able to be independent? Do you think the Nobel Peace Prize will make a difference? Do you think the campaign finance hearings on Clinton himself that'll begin, the Republicans' change of heart to be able to clobber Clinton?
These are not things you try to make predictions about, but that you try to do something about. I don't think there's any way to predict. It depends what happens on the streets. If people make a fuss about it, yeah, it could make a difference.
Professor Noam Chomsky, linguist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, political analyst, activist, and so much more.